there is an ironweed for every garden. And again, I mean, they're beautiful plants. They attract tons of pollinators, including one specialist bee that we saw in the trial garden, which was a ton of fun to watch. Yeah, it's just a great group of plants that I hope more and more people will start adding to their home landscapes.
In today's episode, we're talking with Sam Hoadley. Sam is the manager of horticultural research at Mount Cuba Center, where he evaluates native plant species, old and new cultivars, and hybrids in the trial garden. Hi, Sam. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. And some of our listeners may remember you because you were on in 2023 to discuss Mount Cuba's carex or sedge trials.
That's right.
And that was a really fun episode. A lot of people really enjoy that. I'm still getting comments about it. And today we're going to talk about another group of plants that are also very beautiful. I'd say they're much better known than calyxes or sedges, especially among home gardeners and people wanting to do native plants and stuff like that. So it's going to be another fun conversation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
before we really kick into that group of plants, let's start at the beginning because some of our listeners may not be familiar with Mount Cuba and the trial gardens and what you do. So let's start off talking a little bit about that. And we'll start at the beginning, the very beginning. Where is Mount
Yeah.
Cuba?
Sure. So yeah, Mount Cuba is located in northern Delaware, and we are actually very close to the Pennsylvania border. We are in this tiny little sliver of Piedmont ecoregion in northern Delaware that is it's much more common just north of into the Pennsylvania border, but a very hilly area, forested, very beautiful rural space. And we are Mount Cuba Center is located here, and we are a botanic garden focused on native plants and their conservation.
Yeah, because a lot of people, when they first hear Mount Cuba, they don't put Delaware. I mean, I
Right.
know I didn't when I first heard Mount Cuba Center.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's actually that the name comes from, I believe it's actually derived from an Irish word that was an Irish settlement in this area, and I can't remember exactly the word, but it has over the years evolved to be Cuba. So there's a few that was named for the little settlement in this area, and there's a few institutions around here that are named Mount Cuba Center, or there's the Mount Cuba Observatory, but it's all just kind of descriptive of this small little area in northern Delaware.
Oh, nice. I hadn't heard that part of this story.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I had that Irish name or word to really like drive it home, but that is where it originates from.
So you're focused on native plants,
Yeah.
and then you do these really awesome trials. Can you tell us a little bit about, well, first the trial gardens themselves, and then how are those trials conducted?
Yeah, I think to give you even more context, the trials were set up by the previous owners of Mount Cuba Center. It actually used to be an estate garden, and the Copeland family lived here. They moved here in the 1930s, and it was really became important to them to garden with native plants. That's where they kind of realized their passion was in native plants and open space conservation, and it was really kind of their intention for this their home to eventually be open to the public, and they wanted to inspire people by the beauty and value of native plants. And that kind of lives on today as our mission. And everything we do at Mount Cuba Center, including what we do in the trial garden, ties to that mission. So in the trial garden, which is actually the brainchild of Mrs. Copeland, this was one of the first places in Mount Cuba Center to be repurposed after she passed away. The trial garden used to be the cut flower garden. And after she passed away in 2001, it was then transitioned to a trial space. And that's what we do here. We want to inspire people by the beauty of these native plants, all of these species, cultivars that we're growing in the trial garden. But we also want to inspire people by their value. And in the trial garden, we interpret the value as their ability to support wildlife. Most often, we're looking at insect interactions with the various species and cultivars in the trial garden to try to help people understand which of these plants may be able to best support wildlife in this region, the mid-Atlantic region specifically, and which plants may just be really well adapted to common garden conditions in this area as well.
I love that. Um, and I mean, it's mid-Atlantic, so it really works well if you're in that mid-Atlantic region. For
Sure.
people like me who are in Kentucky, not mid-Atlantic, and I
Right,
know there's a
right.
lot of people from other areas that look at your stuff too. We have to take it with a grain of salt and do um, a little bit of thinking about, okay, does this really apply here? Or how do we tweak it for
Right.
our area? But it does give a lot of, at least general concepts, broad ideas, things to think about, and
Exactly.
pointers for the rest of us too.
Yeah, and I like to think about the trial results and the trial program as giving people a framework to help them make informed decisions about what may or may not work for them. And I mean, the region that we're most likely going to apply most of our results to is the Mid Atlantic, but we found that our results may have applications to New England, the Midwestern US, the Southeastern United States. Richard Hockey at Chicago Botanic Garden has been doing studies there, or trials for decades, and it's really interesting, even though our trials are not necessarily linked or planned together. When we do trial the same groups of plants or genera of plants, it's interesting how frequently a lot of those top performers do kind of cross over both of our trial programs. It's not true in every case, but it does show you that a good plant in one region doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a bad plant in another. And a lot of times it actually means a good plant is a good plant. Of course, there are exceptions to that. But there's also nuance in looking at our trials too. We're evaluating plants in one soil condition. So this is our average garden soil. It's a clay loam, pH between 6 and 7. We don't add anything to it. We're not watering. But some plants are well adapted to that. And even though it's a very hands-off trial program, the plants that are adapted to that program or to those conditions are going to be the plants that are top performers at the end of our trials. But I often talk about species, especially species heavy trials. There's no bad species. It's just certain species are adapted to that middle of the road average or adaptable. Others that really want wet soil conditions or dry soil conditions may not perform really well in the trial garden. But if you have wet soils at home or if you have really dry soils at home, there might be plants in the trial garden that might perform really well for you. So we do try to share why those plants may not perform well in the average and try to tell people where you could use those plants and you might have better results with them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I like about the reports and the trials that you give us because it's the okay, this has worked well and our an average for our area,
Right.
but here's everything else that we tried.
Yeah.
And so it gives you that ability to, like you said, make those informed decisions and maybe try some of those other plants because, yeah, a lot of people have kind of average soil, but then there's a lot of people who have not average soil,
Right.
one
Right.
extreme or the other.
Yep. No, it's really interesting. There are plants in our trial that I feel like I really enjoy gardening with plants that want drier soil and like the kind of that sandy, rocky, gravelly soil. And those plants that I get really excited about in our trials really struggle in the trial garden. And it's tough to watch them because you know they're just not in the right situation for them to thrive. But you think about someone who is growing in that rocky soil, and I think a lot of times people who have that soil are like, "Hi, I wish I had that beautiful clay loam." And I'm like, "Oh no, I want what you have." So it's just interesting that those plants for us aren't the best performers, but maybe just downstate in southern Delaware where the soils are sandy or in a coastal plain situation, they might actually be really, really great garden plants. So we do try to introduce that concept as often as we can in the trials too.
Yeah, because like you said, I mean, the rocky soils too. I mean, there's a lot of rocky soils down here where I'm at.
Sure.
And I hear people all the time, "Oh, I've got these really poor rocky soils. I don't should I bring in more dirt? Should I do this? Should" and I'm like, "No, no, let's find plants that work in
Right.
those rockier soils because there are native plants that really do well and thrive there."
Yeah, it's about embracing those conditions and just I think plant selection is the first step. Researching that plant, understanding that plant is the first step in making sure that your landscape is going to thrive. And hopefully we can give you some of those first steps from our research program here.
And I mean, even if a species that you're testing and trialing isn't native to where, say, I'm at, which a lot of species it's amazing how many species are native
Right.
throughout the range, especially ones that you're going to be trialing because you do a lot of trialing ones that are easier to find.
Yep. Yep.
So, that by definition kinda narrows the range. It makes people like to grow plants that are they can sell in lots of different places. So that means that they want these plants that are have these wide native ranges.
Yep.
So, there's a lot that work well, but even if there isn't one, I found a lot of times I can go, "Okay, he was talking about this plant, this species, but our equivalent here, we may not have that one, but our equivalent here would be this." And
Right.
then I can, again, use those as informed choices to kind of
Exactly.
give you ideas.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully inspire. It's a whole
Yes,
big piece
exactly.
of this. Yep.
So your most current, trial that you just wrapped up, finished the report on and everything, are on the Vernonias, which
Yes.
are what we commonly call the ironweeds,
Right.
which are absolutely gorgeous. I love them because those are your for anybody that might not be familiar with them, which I think a lot of people are, but those are those deep, rich, dark purple flowers that we commonly see in the mid to late summer out in the fields, the prairies, the meadows, the places that you'll see goldenrod in
Yeah.
a month or two, usually
Yep.
after that. And I love it when the ironweeds and the goldenrods are blooming together. That's just
No,
stunning.
it's spectacular.
There's so many butterflies and bumblebees and insects and everything else, and I just love watching them. It really is
Mhm.
a magnet for all kinds of wildlife and critters there.
Yeah, and it's one of those groups of plants. I mean, they have beauty, they have value, and I think I was really excited that we were trialing ironweeds because I feel like, well, many people are familiar with them. I feel like they're often underutilized in a landscape situation, and I feel like this trial was gave us an opportunity to really shine a light on, I think, a really incredible group of plants. And I think people tend to think about ironweeds, at least around us. New York ironweed is our most common species in this area, and people associate it with, it grows in wetter areas and like floodplains or even roadside ditches. Um, but there are ironweeds out there from throughout the eastern temperate forest region, or basically eastern half of the U.S., which is our definition of native in the trial garden, that will grow in just about any soil condition. It's again choosing the right species for your place, but there is an ironweed for every garden. And again, I mean, they're beautiful plants. They attract tons of pollinators, including one specialist bee that we saw in the trial garden, which was a ton of fun to watch. Um, yeah, it's just a great group of plants that I hope more and more people will start adding to their home landscapes.
Yes, and, like, around here, our most common, native species is tall ironweed. I mean, we've got
Hmm.
some New York and Kentucky, but
Yep.
tall ironweed is really the one that you're going to see the most, and so, yeah, a lot of times it's easy for me to go, "Oh, yeah, ironweeds," and I'm thinking tall ironweed, and you
Right.
have to really be careful where you put it because it's called tall ironweed for a reason.
That's right. That's right.
It gets tall sometimes if it
Yes.
really likes where it's at, but there are other species that work really well in other locations. And there are actually, what, 20-ish different species native to North America, about half of which are native to Eastern US, that Eastern temperate, woodlands, ecoregion area.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's there's a surprising amount of diversity. I mean, for a genus that, again, in our area we're familiar with one or two locally native species. Tall ironweed does kind of eke into eastern Pennsylvania, just in a few counties. Um, but um, but yeah, I think when you start going to the southeastern United States and the Gulf Coast, there's so many interesting plants. In the Ozarks, there's a couple of species there that are really really cool. Um, yeah, again, there's a surprising amount of diversity in ironweeds, and even worldwide, they're I believe found on most every continent. But our center of diversity is eastern central U.S. And there are some species that sneak into the western U.S. a little bit too.
And then if you're a botanist and out there kinda nerding out in the wild, ironweeds, especially when the species get close together around kind of those boundary lines where the ranges are coming together,
Hmm.
um, they, hybridize quite
Yes.
frequently.
Yep, they can, and we saw that in the trial garden. And if you have multiple species in close proximity in cultivation that bloom at the same times, you are very likely going to end up with hybrids. And for a plant breeder, that's a great opportunity. But if you really want to have like a species and you want to keep that species, like you want to have it be more wild type and not have those hybrid or intermediate plants, making sure that if you have multiple species, having those bloom times be separate. And there are ways to do that. We saw some of our ironweeds in the trial garden started as early as June and finished in kind of mid to late July. Other plants didn't start blooming until mid, late September through October and November. So there are ways to do that if you really do want the wild type plants to remain that way. But yeah, if you have multiples out there, you're going to end up with some really interesting intermediates, which can be fun. But again, just be aware that that can happen.
Which, I mean, that was something else I wanted to make sure we brought up, was the fact that I mean, I know a lot of people, they love ironweeds and they want one of all the different species.
Right.
This is a big consideration, if
Right.
you're trying to do that with the ironweeds.
Yep. No, I know. Even in my home garden, I have Vernonia angustifolia, gigantea, noveboracensis, And we have these funny intermediates that just show up that nobody planted, but neat garden volunteers that you can a lot of times kind of suss out which of the parents, what the parents might be. And we still see pollinators on them, but it's just something to be aware of again that it's very likely. Same thing with Amsonia. Clematis will do the same thing. When you bring these plants into an artificial setting and cultivation, there's sometimes some mingling that maybe wouldn't happen all the time out in nature, but it still does happen out in the wild in certain situations.
So, how many species did you include in the ironweed trials?
I believe we had 13, but we had, with most of those species, we had multiple versions of each of them. In a lot of cases, we tried to have either a wild collected form of that species as kind of our, and by wild collected, I mean wild collected seed that was then grown on in the greenhouse as kind of our baseline or a control, and then sourcing a plant of that same species from a commercial source. We may not know where the origin of that plant was, and then the next layer would be the cultivars. And most of the cultivars in the Vernonia trial were selections of wild type plants, but there were a few hybrids as well. I think we had 4 different hybrid ironweeds in the trial, but it was very species heavy, and there was a lot of concentration on comparing different ecotypes or origins of the same species. One example, we had I think 7 or 8 forms of New York ironweed, a lot that originated from the Mid Atlantic. We had one selection out there, which we're not really sure where that originally came from. And then we had another form from South Carolina. And it was very interesting seeing how differently the plant, especially from South Carolina, behaved in comparison to our mid Atlantic ecotypes in the trial garden.
Yeah. That would be interesting to really dig into, and it shows how different, like you said, the ecotypes can be and why it's important to,
Right,
if you're trying to keep it more natural in your garden, to pick
right.
those sources that are closer to you
Yeah,
whenever possible.
yeah. Yeah, I think regionally appropriate, if that's your goal, is it can make a big difference in the plant's behavior or where that plant came from in the wild. So for example, New York ironweed in this region tends to grow um, to about 6 to 8, or 6, 7 feet tall. If it's really happy, maybe up to 8 feet. Blooms in August, early September. And we found in the trial garden that our mid-Atlantic ecotype forms of New York ironweed really struggled because they really do want that cool, moist root zone. We're not telling you not don't plant that plant, but if you just have drier, more average garden soils, there are better options that are more adaptable. But if you have wet soils, New York ironweed is a wonderful, wonderful plant. I love growing it at home. But it's very interesting seeing that form from South Carolina that was grown in this, like right next to those plants. It grew taller. It bloomed about a month later. And it didn't seem to have any of the issues with the drought intolerance or stress that was associated with lack of water or disease pressures, which again, those diseases are exploiting a stressed plant that is likely just coming from a mismatch of soil conditions or cultural conditions in the garden to what that plant would prefer in the wild. But it's, same species, but behaving quite differently depending on where it's sourced from in the range.
So, on the plants that you chose, were they all purple flowered ones? Because I mean, we all think ironweed purple flowers, and that's what ironweeds tend to mostly be. But you can have white flowered ironweeds too. I've got a patch that's always white that grows in our backyard that there were wild ones that kind of came in, and I was like, "Oh, I kind of like that. We're just gonna leave them there so we mow around them every year." And
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and that can happen. That there's natural mutations where you have maybe a lack of pigmentation and sometimes or darker pigmentation. Most ironweeds, though, most species, even hybrids, cultivars out there, are that kind of beautiful dark purple. They're just such a spectacular color that actually the camera really struggles to capture. But there are white selections out there. There's one called White Lightning that Gelito sells. It's actually a seed strain. It's pretty reliably white flowering seedlings. Um, but we found that that plant just wasn't overly vigorous. I think that there actually, if there are, if you have, for example, a really vigorous white flowering form of ironweed out there, there is commercial potential. There's always people out there who are interested in kind of the unique or kind of boutique items that maybe wouldn't fit in every home garden, but it certainly is interesting. You don't see it that often, but it's pretty cool when those mutations are found or just seen in the wild. We've heard about some populations that have pinker pop, like slightly more pink flowering forms. Someone recently in this area found a chartreuse foliage form of New York ironweed. So very, different, unique. Maybe not everyone's taste, but there are these kind of interesting aberrant forms that do occur out there in the wild.
Yeah, I was thinking that they were all purple, even the cultivars that you guys
Yeah.
tried, which makes sense because otherwise you're getting too many variables out there to compare to each other.
Yeah, but by far, 44 of the 45 did have purple flowers.
Why did you choose the species? How do you pick which ones you're going to get? Or even, beyond just which species, where are you going to get them from? Because, like you said, you were doing ecoregions as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is it the when we're planning a trial from, I would say, from concept to completion, it's actually like almost an 8-year process. Sometimes 9 years. And the first 3, 4 years of that are, concept, gathering plant material, growing on those plants if we collected seed or purchased seed, getting them to a size that, what might be very similar to what we'd buy in a nursery, and then planting all those plants together to start that trial. It's a kind of a complex system, but generally when we've kind of selected a trial and we go about that through many different ways, maybe we're trying to promote a group of plants that we're really passionate about. We feel like kind of need that spokesperson, maybe. I think ironweed falls into that category. Others, we're just looking, basically doing a market analysis. So I use clone flowers as an example of that. There's just so many options out there. As a consumer, where do you start? Are these plants, are these all the same? Especially from a pollinator perspective, or are they going to be long lived? There's a lot of information is kind of lacking, especially comparing all of these plants to each other. So with some cases, we're just telling people like these are the better ones to buy. And with ironweeds, it was more about, and same with carex, really about, hey, these things exist. They're great. There's potential for some of these other species in cultivation that should be commercially available. So when we've kind of decided on the trial, so once we decide on ironweed, we kind of look at the nursery world, especially in the Eastern United States, and we kind of basically generate a list of what we could purchase. So all of these different species, cultivars, what's out there, and then we use resources like BONAP, the Biota of North America program. We use NatureServe, USDA website, and we look at the species lists of what species are native to the Eastern Temperate Forest region that might not be commercially available. And we try to figure out if any of those plants may have commercial potential or are easy enough to source. Maybe we'll go out and collect seed or work with partners throughout the Eastern United States to collect seed for us, send it to Mount Cuba Center, and we'll grow it on. And that to me is probably one of the most exciting pieces of some of these trials that are very species heavy. Some of these species may not be in cultivation, or rarely cultivated, or maybe not cultivated ever, to my knowledge. And kind of getting to know these plants and understand them. And it's a really, really interesting, unique learning opportunity. But between those plants that are commercially available and sourced from wild seed, that's basically how we accumulate all these plants together. And again, recently there's been a lot of focus in our trials on looking at local ecotypes of species, like even Delaware native, comparing to a species, that form of the species that's out there in cultivation. Maybe we don't know where exactly that seed came from. And then also looking at the cultivar question, or cultivars that may exist of that species, and having almost those 3 layers of comparison, which is fascinating. Sometimes they're very similar in performance, and sometimes they're very, very different. So it's really fun to see that in action, and having them rowed out next to each other, those differences, those similarities really pop out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing that, on this one because I don't think you did that on Carex, but
Yeah,
then
not as
not as
much.
many people were
Yeah,
growing Carexes at the time, but yeah, I
yeah,
really, really enjoyed being able to see that and really do that comparison.
yeah.
So, which were some of the ones that really stood out in your mind for your Mid-Atlantic average soils?
Yeah, there was a few. The one that I would say turned the most heads in the trial garden were the giant ironweeds, the Vernonia giganteas, which we would be very familiar with in your part of the world. But oh my gosh, they're incredible plants. They're, some of them are tremendously tall. Most of our ecotypes came from the southeastern United States. We had 2 collections from Alabama. We had a selection, I believe, from the Carolinas, and another selection from Arkansas. and they generally bloom pretty late. I know the Midwestern and the Midwestern ecotypes, especially of giant ironweed, tend to bloom a little bit earlier. So, like that August window, September. But a lot of these southern forms of giant ironweed were blooming September, October, and we had one that was going into November, which was kind of fascinating to see blooms that late. And it actually coincided perfectly with our migrating monarchs. That was the gas station for the monarchs, if you will. They would just collect there. We actually do monarch tagging and monitoring here at Mount Cuba Center. And we learned pretty quickly that instead of running around the gardens and the natural lands looking for monarchs, we would just wait at the giant ironweeds and they would come to us. But we found that that species, just in general, was very adaptable to the average garden soils, didn't have any signs of stress from lack of water, had no disease pressures, and was just absolutely spectacular in the profusion of flowers it produces. And healthy plants are going to be able to attract and support more insects, just because they're offering more value. Um, and yeah, that was just an incredible plan. That and one selection out there, you may have heard of it, from Arkansas. It's called Jonesboro Giant. Plant Delight selected this a few years ago, I think back in the 2000s. But that plant, it's the largest herbaceous perennial I know of. It reached a height of 15 and a half feet in 2022. It was just, I mean, you could see it from across the gardens, and everyone that went into the trial garden, whether you were a beginner, maybe we're not really familiar with native plants, or that the whole movement, up to like expert gardeners, everyone would be kind of stopped in their tracks by this plant. It was just unbelievable, and surprisingly sturdy for a 15 and a half foot plant. That was one of our favorites. There was another selection, actually, selection by Plantalites called Vernonia angustifolia plum peachy, which is actually a selection of a plant that they found in Georgia, growing in pretty dry soils. But it really makes this beautiful mounding plant, relatively fine foliage that's blushed with kind of this wine colored hue to the stems and the leaves. Has this, again, beautiful shrub like form, incredible flower display. But my favorite piece of it was actually the seed heads. As they ripen, that pappus has this kind of coppery, kind of peachy, purpley color, that same kind of hue that's in the leaves and in the stems. And we found that that plant was really adaptable to average garden soils. Vernonia angustifolia in general grows in drier habitats, kind of sandier, hot, dry. They really don't like the winter wet in the mid Atlantic region. If you want to grow it, that species, you can, but the trial garden soils were just a complete mismatch for what that plant wants to grow in. And we actually had three other accessions of Vernonia angustifolia, and we have 5 plants of each accession. Only a single plant of those other 3 accessions survived. So 1 out of 15 survived from those other 3. And plum peachy, all 5 of the ones we planted survived and looked spectacular at the end of the trial. And then one more. They're all great. I kind of have a hard time containing or picking my favorites. But another top performer that I really like that is fairly commercially available is Vernonia lettermanii. And there's a selection out there called Iron Butterfly. And Vernonia lettermanii is found in the Ozark region and kind of these cobble bars in riparian corridors. Has this beautiful fine textured foliage, which looks a lot like Amsonia hubrichtii. It has that lower mounding form. If you grow it in drier soils, full sun, it's going to be completely happy. If you grow it too rich, it tends to splay open a little bit. But that plant, I think it's one of those plants we just want to treat it too well in the garden. But if you just plant it correctly, you put it in some drier soils, it's an absolutely spectacular plant. And another smaller plant, so that if you don't have a ton of room, there are some smaller ironweed options for you if you don't have the space to accommodate, say, like a 12 or a 15-foot ironweed. But they're all great. I wish I could plant every single one of them.
Yeah, that's one of the problems I hear with concerns, we'll say, not really problems, but
Sure.
concerns from a lot of home gardeners around me is that, I mean, like I said, Gigantea, tall ironweed, is our
Yeah.
primary native species here. And not everybody has space for a 10 to 12-foot tall
Right.
plant
Right.
growing like that. So it does raise concerns. And that was one of the things that I also really liked about this trial and the report was that you also looked at management techniques
Right.
and cutting back, because that's one of the things that I tell people a lot of times with a lot of different species, especially the asters,
Yep.
um,
Absolutely.
is if they're getting too tall, just Give them a little artificial deer browsing.
Yeah, there you go.
Cut them
Yep,
back a little bit. Don't worry
perfect.
about timing, don't worry about anything like that. Deer don't care what angle they're eating it at or what time of the year, they're
Yeah.
just going to munch. And
Mhm.
so just pretend like you're a deer and snip it off a little bit. And you guys did some testing of that with the ironweeds too, didn't you?
We did. Yeah, we did. We did it in late May, early June, which is, I mean, typically that kind of cutback of those actively growing stems called the Chelsea chop. That timing coincides with the Chelsea flower show, which is where the name comes from. But we did that with a lot of the ironweeds to see if we could reduce the size of some of these really tall species and see what would happen if we cut back some of these more mounding plants and see if there were any kind of overlying or underlying trends with this treatment to all these plants. Like we do it a lot at Mount Cuba Center with our asters, just like you were saying. There are a few ironweeds that I would absolutely recommend doing this with, especially some of the lower growing plants that have finer leaves. They really respond well to that treatment. You end up with a slightly shorter plant, much tighter in form, much more resistant to that opening or splaying in the middle, which is pretty typical of iron butterfly, Vernonia lettermanii. There's really two options to fix that flopping: either plant it in dry soils or do the Chelsea chop. If you kind of go either of those routes, you're going to end up with a really, really great plant. Um, and even plants like plum peachy, Vernonia angustifolia, handled that treatment really well. We did not see a great reaction from the taller species, like so Vernonia gigantea, Vernonia noveboracensis, mazurica, baldwinii. A lot of these really tall, kind of vase-shaped plants, they would break buds and kind of develop a lower, more shrubby habit, if you will. But often the union of those new growths to the old stems was pretty weak, and especially once they started to develop flowers and get a little bit of weight to them. And if we went through a storm and those inflorescences got wet and there was a little bit of wind, often those new growths would kind of break right at that union. So it's probably for some of those taller species, probably not the best option, although you can go that route. You might have to do a little bit more staking. Um, but especially for those smaller plants, it can really make a very tidy little mounded plant. But one thing you do have to kind of consider when you're doing this is often that cutback, or I'd say almost always, that cutback is going to result in a delayed bloom period. Now, it may just be a week, it might be a couple of weeks, but there might be a difference in in the timing of those flowers and what insects might be able to access them. So we saw that timing of those blooms to be a very important factor for a specialist bee that we observed. So by cutting back some of those plants, you may be actually delaying a flower to a point where that plant's no longer accessible to that specialist pollinator. There's going to be plenty of other insects that you'll see on those plants, but yeah, I would just say that's a consideration to have. But you're right, as far as timing is concerned of cutting these plants back, ironweed are very adaptable. We see there's fields near us where there are ironweed present, and those fields are hayed, even in kind of late summer. And like it would be hard to imagine that plant being able to recover and to bloom after it was mowed to 6 or 8 inches from the ground. But they pop right back up. They're going to be tiny little plants, but they do flower. It's again just significantly later than they typically would.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because that is definitely a consideration when we're trying to do more than just plant for pretty flowers, when we're trying to plant for creating these backyard ecosystems in this pollinator and wildlife habitat, is that we have to also take into account what's using it and when. And
Right.
like you said, the specialist bee for ironweed, denticulate longhorn bee, is that the right
That's
one?
exactly right. Yep.
Yep. They're not active necessarily for the whole entire time that ironweed is blooming. They've got a small window, so you've gotta keep it in that window if you're trying to help that particular species of bee, or
Right.
any of the other specialists that might be with any other species besides just ironweeds.
Yeah, these specialists they have a window to complete their life cycle, basically, or complete that stage of their life cycle. And we found, at least with ironweed, ironweed in the trial garden, these Melisodes bees that we were counting separately, were active exactly when our locally native species of ironweed were blooming. Which, I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. Yeah, it's like, of course. The interesting thing was that locally native species, Vernonia noveboracensis and Vernonia glauca, they just struggled in the trial garden. It was, again, a mismatch of cultural conditions for these plants. And because of that struggle, they had issues with disease, habit. They didn't produce as many flowers. We just didn't count that many bees there. But if you went out to our natural lands where there's stands of New York ironweed just growing there naturally, most of them were not planted, at least by us. You saw tons and tons of melisodes there on healthy plants because they were growing where they want to grow. They're growing. They were correctly sited. Um, it's very interesting seeing that, again, a healthy plant's going to be able to support more insects. So siting that plant correctly is a huge first step to ending up with a healthy, thriving ecosystem, even in your backyard. But what we found in the trial garden is, even though those New York ironweeds were not blooming well and not, supporting a lot of insect activity during that month of August and early September, there were other species of ironweed that are not locally native to us, but very adaptable to the average garden soil. So Vernonia baldwinii was a great example of that. More Western species, Midwestern, even into Eastern Colorado, that just could handle those drier conditions in the trial garden, really put on a great flower show, just, again, because they were robust enough, they were getting what they needed with our limited care, and they were able to support lots of melisodes bees. Yeah, if we wanted to see melisodes, we knew that the Vernonia baldwinii was where we should spend most of our time, because they bloomed during that same time period, and they were just more adaptable to our garden conditions. So it was just interesting. It was one of those kind of zoomed in views of that whole question of whether cultivars are better than straight species or vice versa. Do cultivars have value? Does locally native matter? And it was just very interesting to have 45 options for this specialist ironweed bee that we know really only has one or two options without people bringing in plants from other parts of the country. But seeing that ironweeds were able to support them from other parts of the eastern U.S. Was very interesting. But again, timing was very, very important for that bee.
And it kind of makes sense too, to me, thinking about that those other species from other areas would support, because that bee has a pretty wide range
It does.
throughout the eastern US. So
Yeah.
it's using it in other places. So yeah, it would make sense that the timing and the health of the timing of the bloom and the health of the plant would be the two
Yes.
big factors there.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that finding the timing is really important can even inform natural lands managers. So if you have like a field with ironweed, whatever the species, wherever part of the country you're from, if you are haying that field or cutting those plants back prior to their blooms, you're likely delaying those blooms. Again, those plants are going to reflush, they're going to rebloom if they possibly can, but it may have delayed that resource to a point where it's then inaccessible to that specialist. So I think one of our treatments is to kind of have a mixed approach to even a field. So leaving up a stand of that New York ironweed, making sure there's some resource there, not mowing everything 100%, not treating everything all the exact same way, I think can be a really good strategy to making sure there's some resources that are kind of following that same natural timing that they would be.
Yes. And I mean, I've heard that often recommended, especially like for mowing in the fall
Yeah,
or burning in the fall, is to
right.
have that mixed
Exactly.
age group, apply different treatments at different, or apply a treatment to a different piece of the land each time. So you've always got that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a really good thing to think about, that that's doesn't just apply to after everything's over, we think of for the season, but also during the season as well.
Right, right, exactly.
And another thing I found really interesting and really enjoyed reading about in this report was you did look at the health of the plant and some of the diseases that they get, and how
Yeah.
that not just impacted how it looked, but also impacted how the insects were using the plant. I thought that was a very interesting piece to be added in there too.
Yeah, so we had a couple diseases that really took a toll on some of the plants in the trial garden, and it was really powdery mildew and rust, and this really showed up in a big way, kind of late summer, and impacted some species kind of disproportionately. And again, a lot of the times it was species that were just not well adapted to the soil conditions. These plants were stressed, and the diseases were able to capitalize on that stress. But again, if the plant hasn't bloomed in that point and it's getting a disease infection that's unsustainable, it won't flower well, it won't support a lot of insects. But there is the other side of it too. There's a species called Vernonia fasciculata, which is native to more the Midwestern US that grows in similar habitats to where New York ironweed grows for us, kind of in these wetter habitats. And it's another one that didn't turn out to be terribly well adapted to the average garden soils. But because it blooms so early, it's completed that stage of its life cycle and was able to support tons and tons of pollinators before the powdery mildew and the rust really kind of started to have a major impact on that plant's health. So it basically completed that part of its life cycle, but that wasn't true for most of the ironweeds out there that started blooming in, late July, September, October. By the time that those plants were blooming or trying to bloom, some of those species like New York ironweed had just unsustainable levels of disease, which we see a lot in the trial garden. If there's going to be a disease pressure, we're going to see it in the trial garden. There's just so many plants there that they're similar and they're in close proximity. They're all susceptible to similar diseases. But that can almost be a good thing. It can really, when the plant is resistant to disease in the trial garden, we know that that plant in a cultivated setting where it's not surrounded by very similar plants is going to behave very differently and likely have very, very little disease pressures. Again, if you're siting that plant correctly, that's again that first step: right plant, right place. Um, but like Vernonia gigantea, Vernonia lettermanii, Vernonia angustifolia plum peachy, no disease issues at all. It was really incredible to watch, like Vernonia fasciculata right next to Vernonia gigantea, just like covered in white powdery mildew and rust, and the plant right next to it perfectly healthy, really no issues. But I'm sure the tables might be turned if the soils were really wet and moist in the trial garden. The performance of that plant, it might be healthier and more robust, able to resist those diseases much more. But yeah, it's very fascinating to see that. We only had really one like pest pressure, if you will, in the trial garden. That was Japanese beetles, but they only showed up on Jonesboro giant, Vernonia gigantea, and they only fed on the very tips of the newest growth. And then they disappeared, and that kind of cleared up, and that was the only issue. But we had caterpillars feeding on the foliage. We had ironweed curculio weevil, which was, we don't consider those to be pests. Those are native insects that it's actually, we think of as a bonus to see them utilizing those plants in other ways. Of course, we are able to measure or look at the pollinator and insect interactions with these flowers of these various species and cultivars, but it's always really exciting to see wildlife utilizing the trial garden plants in other ways. As a host plant, as habitat. It's really, really, those are the interactions I think that are really fun to observe.
Oh, yes. And of course, I mean, with those caterpillars, not only are you getting the butterflies and the moths that they're going to turn into,
Yep. Yeah.
but you're also attracting birds because that's the baby food. And
That's
so,
right.
yeah, you want to have it all there.
Yep. Well, a fun story actually with those giant ironweeds. The ironweed curculio weevil will essentially lay its eggs on in a trench that it will make in the side of the stem, and the larvae of that beetle will kind of bore their way down through the pith of the stems. Really, we saw very little impact on the plant's health at all, and they really just impacted the tallest species, or they were present in the tallest species. But we would see woodpeckers landing on the stems of the giant ironweeds and going in after those little grubs, and the ironweeds were able to handle that kind of really invasive feeding from the woodpeckers. And again, it was just one of those really cool interactions that was unexpected, but we saw it again and again and again. It was just one of those fascinating, you know, one of those fascinating experiences in the trial garden that I I would have never guessed we would see woodpeckers landing on the stem of a perennial and getting something out of it. It's incredible.
Yeah, those downy woodpeckers, it's amazing what they will go after,
Yep.
and how many of those tall plants like that they'll go after and find those little critters. And I've seen it in a couple of different
Yeah.
species, them doing that.
Yep. That was a lot of fun.
So, what were some of the caterpillars? Do you remember off the top of your head that you were watching using it?
Yeah, there was Spilosoma. So it was the yellow woolly bear was most the ones that we saw, and there was many different color like forms or morphs, if you will. We had ones that were really kind of white to yellow to caramel colored. That was the species we saw quite a lot of. We did see some of the flower feeding caterpillars, the ones that will kind of tack the floral parts to their backs to camouflage themselves. We saw a few of those. We didn't actually see this caterpillar in the trial garden, but adults of this moth have been picked up in moth surveys of our natural areas. This was the ironweed borer moth. which we were kind of hoping we would see in the trial garden, but we didn't actually get to see them. Um, but yeah, it again shows you how much these plants are really doing to support wildlife, even in a cultivated setting. Those yellow woolly bears found the trial garden. Those melisodes found the trial garden really quickly. We saw them years 1 and year 2, and they were supporting these insects with relatively complex life cycles. And it just goes to show me that that can apply to a home garden, even if it's a smaller home garden. You can support those life cycles as well in similar ways.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, at the beginning, the monarchs were
Yeah.
loving it when they were, around and coming through, so,
Yeah.
yeah, I see a lot of monarchs on ours too.
Yeah, it seems to be a favorite, and I know there's a lot of focus on milkweeds, and rightly so. But I think there's thinking about plants that can support those migrating adult monarchs too, and giant ironweed seems to be really like a one of those perfect candidates for us. It was just like they were maybe not always there, but it was a very very popular plant with them.
American bumblebee is
Yeah,
another one that I often see on our, tall ironweed in the fall.
absolutely.
If I'm gonna find them, that's where I go to look for them
Yeah.
at, is the ironweeds. I mean, it just seems like that's always where they're
Yeah,
at.
then we would see a lot of skipper butterflies, silver spotted skippers, a lot of the smaller brown skippers that I can't identify, but there was dozens or hundreds of them, sometimes on a single plant at any given time. It would seem that there would be just these patches, if you will, of the skippers, and there would just be everywhere. And yeah, it's especially kind of that late summer and fall transition. There's a lot of activity. Um, yeah, just generalist pollinators, specialists. Ironweed has a lot going on for it in terms of ecological value.
Yeah, and I'm gonna make sure I get out more this fall and look for those specialist bees because I don't know if I've never seen them, but I've never recognized them or paid attention
Right.
to them if I have. Because I mean, there's always bees on the ironweed,
Yep.
but to actually look and say, "Oh, wait a minute, that's that one. That's the specialist bee." I haven't done that one yet.
Yeah, they're really fun. They're very charismatic. And to just give people an idea of what they're looking for, the females are the easiest to key in on because they're collecting the ironweed pollen, which is bright white. It almost looks like a bleached flower. Like it's just like it really grabs you visually. And even though it's a small bee, it's maybe half the size of a honeybee. Focusing in on those hind legs that are packed with that white pollen is a really great way to see them, even when they're moving pretty quickly. But they're black and white. They move pretty quickly. The males even more so. They're very erratic in their movement. They're just nectaring, looking for females. But you can really watch those females. They're just methodically going flower to flower, collecting that pollen, which they'll bring back to their ground nest to provision their larvae with. But yeah, they're very cool. They're a lot of fun to watch, and we didn't know they were there. I just again didn't recognize them until we had an entomologist on site. Said, "Oh, we've got melisodes here." And we were like, "Oh yeah, that's really cool." And then we decided that we have this opportunity to count them. Felt like we got to know them and understand like, oh, they're getting out of bed a little late today. They're they're showing up a little later. Where this is that big day for the melisodes or not so much, and you started to learn their favorites. And but they're a lot of fun to watch. And knowing how to recognize them. You see them at home, you'd see them out on walks. They're around. They're a pretty common bee. If you have ironweeds in your home garden or out in natural areas around you, just take a look and look for those little white packs of pollen on those hind legs of those bees. You'll probably see them.
I was thinking the males would have been easier because of the long antenna, the long horns, but
Yeah, which is where they get their name from. The females have relatively short antenna, but the males are they're very fast, very difficult to photograph. We was one of those that we were like, we really wanted to get a good photo of them for the report, and they were giving us a heck of a time trying to get a good image of them. The females, again, they'd spend a little more time on flowers. They were easier to get in and get a close picture of. But yeah, and we would see there was a pretty, I would say a small proportion of the melisodes that we saw was male. It was maybe I tend to say like one out of every dozen melisodes that we saw was a male. The majority of the insects that were counted were females. That's just because we simply saw more of them. We were counting both. But yeah, again, totally fun to watch. A really cool native bee.
yes, it sounds like it is. Let's see. Is there anything else that you think we should talk about here?
Yeah, I mean, there's always new things going on in the trial garden. If you are able to come, or if you're in the area, we open April 1st. We close around Thanksgiving. But the trial garden, there's always something new to see. We try to have something in spring, summer, and fall. Spring, we have our Tiarella trial. We have ferns, which are going into their third year of their evaluation, which is a lot of fun. We're not really seeing pollinator interactions, but we are still seeing wildlife utilizing the ferns. It's really fascinating. Even some caterpillars that kind of do that tying of the leaves and make those little fern balls that they'll feed on the foliage within. There's the fern trial is really fascinating. And then in the summer, we've got a new pycnanthemum trial, which is if you're looking for pollinator interaction, that is the place to be. We have Physostegia, which we've seen a lot of interesting insects on, and other pollinators, including hummingbirds. We have an oak leaf hydrangea trial, which is kind of our second part to our general hydrangea evaluation. We looked at wild hydrangeas. Now we have the oak leaves. And we also have a milkweed trial, which is we're really kind of focusing in on the monarch aspect, which I mean, you may have guessed that. But we're trying to understand, we have 25 commercially available milkweeds and trying to understand which of these plants in cultivation these monarchs are maybe favoring or utilizing more. So again, if you are a small home garden or have a small home garden, maybe just helping you choose which milkweed will kind of give you the best chance of supporting monarchs in your home landscape. But yeah, lots going on. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but and we're actually going to be planting a new trial this spring on what we're calling the blue stems. So Schizocarium, Andropogon, a lot of cultivars, but a lot of species. We did a lot of collecting locally, even in Delaware, to try to showcase the incredible diversity that exists in these two incredible genera of grasses. So again, lots going on, and always something to see. And coming up next year, we'll be talking about a new publication on goldenrods, which I'm really, really excited about. So that was a trial we did, looked at 70 different goldenrods. And again, another group that is just incredible at supporting wildlife and cultivation, pollinators, other insects. As you know, we saw several different species of caterpillars feeding on the foliage. We saw warblers utilizing those plants, picking in the fall during their migration, picking off all the little insects that were present there on the plants and in the flowers. It's just, I mean, another trial that, I mean, I get excited about a lot of the trials, I would say, but they're all a lot of fun. Always something to see and to check out in the trial garden.
Oh, yes. I mean, you've got a bunch there that I'm like, "Oh, we gotta have you back for this one, this one, this one, this one."
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah, there's so many here that because I mean, goldenrods and the milkweeds, of course, because, well, they're milkweeds. You
sure, sure.
just have to do that one, but goldenrods are another one of my favorites, always have been.
Mine too.
Ferns are ones that everybody's always asking about, especially for shade gardens and stuff. I mean, there's just like oh, and the pycnanthemums. Yes, the mountain
They're
mints are
they're incredible.
yes.
From a pollinator aspect, just from an insect activity aspect, it is just like it's a little overwhelming. And I've been joking a lot about like how we're possibly going to count all these pollinators because it's we're very lucky to have a robust pollinator team called the Pollinator Watch Team who's observing these plants and counting these pollinators. And just like how are we even going to do this with the pycnanthemum? There's just so much activity. There's so much diversity. I mean, it's a great problem to have, but we're gonna have to get creative, I think. But
Yeah, definitely. I bet. Yeah, because like you said, they're just amazing, and if you wanna
yeah.
see really cool wasps in the
Oh
summer,
yeah. Oh
that's where
yeah.
you go for that.
Yep. No, it's amazing. I feel like every time I'm out there, I see a species of wasp I don't think I've ever seen before. And there's blue wing wasp is a pretty common wasp in our area. It actually parasitizes Japanese beetle larvae. And there was a week when all of a sudden there again must have been a hatch of blue wing wasps, and there were thousands of them on the pycnanthemum. It was just like it was an experience, and it was a really cool way to get people up close to these insects. And people sometimes have a little bit of a phobia about bees and wasps, but getting people comfortable and realizing those bees they're interested in one thing, they're not going to bother you. I think it's kind of a exposure therapy, I guess, of bees and wasps. um but yeah.
And it's not just the, flowers that are
Yeah.
providing so much for them because when I go out and I'm cutting things back in the spring, that's one of the ones there's this I'll start cutting back usually about the time the red buds bloom,
Hmm.
especially the mountain mints, the pygnanthrums, because there's this little bitty, teeny tiny gnat-sized, I'm assuming it's a bee. It could
Yeah.
be one of the gnat-sized wasps, but I'm assuming it's a
Yeah.
bee that just absolutely, as soon as I cut those stems back, they're in them.
Oh,
And there'll
cool.
be, like, maybe a week where it's just, like, flurry of activity and then
Yep.
nothing. And so, I mean, even in those what we think of as the off season for it, they're
Yeah.
still doing a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, we see those same camouflaging caterpillars. We've seen a lot of them on the pycnanthemum, those caterpillars that are attaching floral parts and bits of leaves and detritus themselves. And it takes a minute to recognize them, but I mean they're out there too. And there's a sphinx moth that specializes in pycnanthemum. We haven't seen that yet, but fingers crossed. But again, these kind of hubs of ecological activity, it's hard to go wrong with pycnanthemums and goldenrods and ironweeds. Like they're just these powerhouses that you can include in your whole landscape.
And they're gorgeous too, so
Yes,
it's if you're going for pretty, these are beautiful in and of themselves, so,
that's right.
yeah, we're
Yeah,
definitely
best of
gonna have
both
to have you
worlds.
again.
Yep, exactly. Yeah,
But yes, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast again and for sharing the results of the Vernonia trials with us. And for all of our listeners, I'll have a link in the show notes to the research report so you can find it very easily, as well as for the other trials that Mount Cuba's conducted.
thanks again very much for having me, and I look forward to being back soon.
As always, I want to thank our patrons and other financial supporters who go above and beyond to help us produce free content focused on creating thriving backyard ecosystems that you can enjoy and be proud of. And if you want to learn more about ironweeds that work really well in garden settings, check out this video and don't forget to take some time to enjoy the nature in your backyard.